the southern states was the only state that did not have a civil rights museum, a place like this that fosters the culture of people that had to fight for their freedom, justice, and equality. So I want to thank Mr. Hatton and the Boy Scouts for being here, because these are these young men up here are our future. This is why we're doing this for you, because we don't collect these artifacts and things like what museums do. It's going to be lost. We're losing our people who participate in this every day. So again, that's what's happening, and one of the reasons why we have a passionate approach to bring about the Civil Rights Museum here in Orangeburg, in South Carolina's first and only. What was it like for a youth like myself at that time? It was tough going, but even though we were like 35 miles from Somerton here in Orangeburg, we had similar, except I think generally because of the presence of two HBCUs, the families might have been a notch up with an income more than many of the farmers and the dirt farmers and the sharecroppers in Clarendon County. We might have been $5 more up the scale from other people, but many of us had to walk to school. The schools were not very well prepared. The teachers also, in some cases, although I do believe I had a very good education because our teachers cared and they did the best we could. We had hand-me-down books. I remember looking in one of my books, in fact, and seeing names. I just got the book and I had these names that, and a piece of a chewing gum and things like that in the book, I got. So it was pretty rough. Although the schools I went to, they did have indoor plumbing, but in Clarendon County, they didn't even have indoor plumbing. It was an outhouse with many homes in Orangeburg. But as a youth in Orangeburg and coming from a mixed heritage, where my family members, some resemble being white, Native American, and black, I was really a mixed up kid. I didn't know, my mother it was a tough time trying to explain to me, again, what is known as race. Race, something that is made by man. In other words, there's one race, the human race, but mankind and scientists have made race into separating us even further than we are. But there's one race, and that is the human race. But my mother did a good job. But my first experience in racism happened when I went into a store in downtown Orangeburg and bought a car with the $1 my mother had given me. The car cost 85 cents. And the clerk was going to give me the 15-cent change back. And when she gave me the change back, and I was right in front of the counter, and kind of peering up, because I, again, about 9, 10, 11 years old, the clerk slammed the change down, and the change jumped up in the air. The 10 cent and the 5 cent jump up in the air. And I asked my mother as we left the store, and I was buying this little toy car, because I was fascinated with automobiles, even today. Anyway, I asked my mother what all that was about, and she explained to me that probably the clerk resented us just even being in the store because we were people of color. So that was one of my first experiences of what it was like during those days.
So in 1950, here are parents, young men and women, enduring what Mr. Williams and Mr. Briggs have described. This is not uncommon, right? So what do you do? What do you do to resist, to protest, to fight? And what we see happening in South Carolina in the late 40s is that through the NAACP and other organizations, people are now saying enough is enough. We're going to find a path to fight against this. And so as Mr. Briggs described, in Clarendon County, with the support of Reverend J.A. Delane and the NAACP, they began to fight. They began to push for legal challenges to segregation. What we'd like to talk about now is how that campaign came to be, and who were some of the men, women, and organizations that helped to shape this. You have on the board around us Levi Bird, J.A. Delane. On the far end, you will see Mr. and Mrs. Briggs. Around the room, you'll see a photograph of a man named Harold Boulware, who is the state NAACP attorney. A woman in the room, Jessica Monteith Simpkins, who helped organize, strategize, and help fund some of the campaigns. And so, Mr. Briggs, will you kind of walk us through, you had these 20 families who signed their names on a petition, and they could have easily walked away. In fact, some families did walk away. Some families said, we cannot endure the reprisals, the attacks. But your family and 19 others stayed the course. Could you explain, sort of from the petition to the courts, what your family endured and witnessed in that window of time? And then, what compelled the 6th grader and his family to leave Somerton?
To endure something that's separate but equal. That was the law. That's a Supreme Court law. And it came for all those years leading up to 1954. The stuff was not, especially the school system, was never equal. That's where the fight, real fight began. My parents and others, and I say Briggs v. Elliott and others, because there are others, who signed the petition, they knew that reprisal will come. My parents knew the reprisal. They didn't know how tough it would be. So 20 names on that petition, they went about the town and the council. Anybody name on that petition that we can fire you, is gonna fire you. If you got a loan in the bank, we're gonna fire you. Let's pay up all at one time. So obviously they fired my father. Now here is 5 of us in the house, 5 children, the mother, no money coming in. How do you eat? We're from a kind of poor community, farming community. So my dad in 1957, through trying to find odd jobs in Clarendon County as a house painter, some other odd jobs he was doing, fired my mother because she worked at the motel. Now look at Clarendon County. 50, 60 years ago, the main highway from New York City to Miami, Florida was Highway 301. And that Highway 301 came directly to my hometown. Went to that one traffic light in town, make a left turn and head to Miami, Florida.
Let's pause, Mr. Briggs, for young people. How did y'all come from Charleston? 26? I-26? You went up that interstate?
You go in somebody's cotton field. So the educational system geared to economics was, the ladies did learn how to sew, got the proper name for it. The men, or the boys, learned how to go in somebody's field, agriculture. So that was 2 things was geared for us to do, go in somebody's field, somebody's kitchen. That wasn't working. So when you have no money, Dad moved to Florida in 1957, the house that he built for his bride, my mother, and he built for his 5 children. I'm the last of the youngest of the children. He left that and went to Miami, lived in a rooming house to send money back to us. When you're poor, no telephone. Dad would call up once a month, twice a month. We walk to the funeral home and I hear my dad's voice on the phone. So that was hard for us because he had to live in a rooming house, but he had to give up his I call it his mansion for his bride. And who would do that? 3 years later, we left our community in South Carolina and moved to Miami, Florida with him. For me, seeing my dad back for, when you're a certain age, your dad is your best friend. And he was mine. But that's the kind of stuff that he had to endure. When we got to Miami, Florida in 1960, the Cuban crisis exploded in South Florida. The black folks lost jobs. Nobody want to write about it, but I lived it. So we were so poor. We moved to Miami on a Greyhound bus. A year later, Florida was still segregated. I went to all-black high school. My sister and brother went to Booker T. Washington. I went to Dunbar. Miami Beach was segregated. We couldn't go to Myrtle Beach. Not Myrtle Beach. Miami Beach. We had to go to a little place called London. It's the same beach, y'all. It's the same water. But being poor, we moved back into South Carolina. Went back into the all-black schools in Scotch Branch. Some of the teachers, when I got back there a year later, they didn't like all the Briggs kids because we was upsetting a system that's gotten them paid, even though they were underpaid. But all those black teachers like me. A year later, parents got enough money, we left South Carolina for good, moving to New York City. If you got no money, you're very poor. We had no car. But I would tell you to endure that. They never spoke of the hard feeling that they went through. My parents never talked about, never used the N-word, never ever used in my house, never talked about other races of people they had to endure this pain of not having. But I give my mother the hardship of keeping a house in South Carolina while her husband was away. How did we get to Florida? Well, we can't take furniture on the bus. So we can rock around in a box that was our luggage and took some silverware. Moved back to South Carolina into New York City the same way, poor, on a Greyhound bus with a rope with luggage. So that's part of the system. Now we get into New York City. Dad was probably 5th, 8th grade education. Now the lower end jobs, how do you get work? So now you start from the bottom all up again. In 1963, when the March on Washington came, I asked Mama later on, why didn't you go to the March on Washington? You know, we're in New York City, didn't have the money. We were on the road for almost 10 years. Where does the money come from to go? Can't take off work. She would rejected a little bit what the movement was doing in the South. Bringing on the movement led by Dr. King and others, that movement forgot about the struggle in South Carolina. That didn't come along with that movement. The historians write, and the subject for a minute, but I think historians write about the civil rights movement with Dr. King's leadership, but forgot about the human rights movement here in South Carolina. That's my conversation about how do we get lost.
We want to talk about that for a moment too, because in 1962, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. makes a trip to South Carolina. He comes to Orangeburg. He visits the home of the Sultans, and one of the Sultans is here today. He goes to Charleston, and he also goes to Manning. And in Manning, he says the movement which he now leads is built upon the struggles of unsung heroes. And he mentions the name of the men and women of Somerton. So here we are, many of us know about Dr. King, but we don't know about the very people he pointed to, who he said opened the door, who paved the way. And that's partly what we're doing today, is to speak about those who opened the door and who paved the way. And one of the important topics that we want to talk about, I said earlier, May 17, 1954 was a turning point in American history. It changed the nation. But Mr. Briggs just said something that I need every young person to remember. Nothing changed in Somerton. Even though the Supreme Court outlawed racial segregation in public schools, nothing changed in Somerton. But things changed in the country. So Mr. Williams, one important moment that you remember well as a young kid, the lead lawyer in Briggs v. Elliott is a man named Thurgood Marshall. Would you talk about your encounter with Marshall, and why is it important for us here to know that the lead attorney in Briggs v. Elliott, not Brown v. Board, Briggs v. Elliott, was Thurgood Marshall?
I have fond memories of Thurgood Marshall, the legendary attorney for the NAACP, who again in the Supreme Court presented the case that ultimately became Brown versus Board of Education. Before I go any further, I just want to do a little housekeeping here to say that everything we've done in this museum is not done. We stand on the shoulders of so many. For example, we have in the back Mr. Jim Felder over here, who again is our chairman of the board of the museum. Dr. Donaldson is on our board of advisors. Dr. Sultan there, would you raise your hand? Dr. Sultan is on our board. Dr. Hines, retired professor of history. Dr. Hines, would you raise your hand, please? Vivian Glover back there, please, again, who is on our board of advisors. And I don't want to miss anyone else, but was Janie in here, or did she?
Now for golf courses. What does it mean now for segregated beaches? What does it mean now for segregated buses? What does it mean now for segregated movie theaters, hotels, and lunch counters? And they began a campaign to ask that question in all these places. Right behind Mr. Williams is a photograph of a young woman, 1 month after Brown v. Board, Briggs v. Elliott, who asked the question, what does segregation on buses mean? And How can I fight against it? Her name is not Rosa Parks. Her name is Sarah Mae Fleming. June 1954. In a little town not too far from here called Ellery, South Carolina. 21 teachers asked the same question. If the courts outlaw racial segregation in schools, why must we swear allegiance to South Carolina and declare that we are not members of the NAACP? And why do those teachers who refuse to sign that contract are fired? And the irony of me making this statement, 21 teachers are fired from their jobs. And today, 1 hour from where we are now, one of those teachers will be funeralized. Her name is Laura Pickett Fleshman. She died last week at 93 years old, but lived long enough to tell Mr. Williams and others why she was adamant that she was not going to leave the NAACP in order to keep her job. And so she was fired from her job as a result of what? Believing in the Constitution of the United States and believing that Brown v. Board mattered. Now, speaking of Brown v. Board, this is the last question I'll have before we turn to the audience. On the program that Mr. Williams has prepared, there's a stunning statement that is worth studying closely. It is a statement written by a man named David Robinson, who did a book about a man named James Burns, who held nearly every major position in this country, including being governor of South Carolina. And Mr. Williams and others believe rightly that James Burns was adamant that we would never study Briggs v. Elliott. We would study another case called Brown v. Board, and makes the case that at the last hour, Mr. Burns communicates to Kansas and asks that they move forward their case, move forward a case called Brown v. Board ahead of Briggs v. Elliott. Now, in many matters, that's just a legal maneuver. But for us, it's important. Why? Because every textbook in this country has a section on the civil rights movement that references Brown versus the Board of Education and does not speak about the footnote cases below that. And so there has been a compelling argument that the case of Briggs v. Elliott has been deliberately and intentionally buried. Therefore, those men and women of Somerton have not gotten the proper recognition that they deserve. Well, here we are today, where two men before us on this stage, in front of you, are adamant that they're going to fight to the very end that Briggs v. Elliott is rightly recognized as the lead case that changed this country. So, Mr. Williams and Mr. Briggs, talk now about what you've done in the last 5 years or so to make sure that this case is not forgotten, and why you believe to your core.
9 years old. And at 14, often when things happen here in Orangeburg, the NAACP leadership knew that I had a camp. So the president of the Orangeburg NAACP, who was an attorney, Mr. Morgan, took me to Charleston when Thurgood Marshall was coming to engage with the Briggs petition in Charleston, South Carolina. And that presented an opportunity that today seems to me like it was just yesterday. We arrived in the evening when Thurgood Marshall was to arrive at the train station that's at the same place in Charleston it is today, all those years ago. And I had my camera prepared as he was going to step off the train. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you are now in the era of digital, and everything is digital. Back during those days, we used film. We had to put film in the camera. And for light, you have built into your cell phone, there's a light that goes off if you need it to take a picture. And you see the picture immediately. We had to develop it and do all kinds of things to make it a photograph. But as Thurgood Marshall stepped off the train, 14 years old, I clicked the picture. Now, I only took one picture. And one of the reasons being that a flash bulb, which it took me to illuminate the picture, cost about $1. And often, and I don't think the NAACP would mind me saying this. Often when I did pictures for the NAACP, we didn't get paid. But we knew it was something that we should have done. And I had a little better than an average camera that was able to capture that. And so that picture today has been on the cover of many books. But in reality, beyond the picture I took at 14 years old, a Thurgood Marshall stepping off the train to engage in what has become one of the most famous cases in history, was beyond that. To ride around in an automobile where Thurgood Marshall is talking to the other upper folks, the other folks in the car with me, and to listen to what they talk. Now, one of the things I remember, and I would never say this, maybe in some audiences, that as Thurgood Marshall had his long arm stretched across the back of the car, this was before there were bucket seats in cars, the driver here, and me in the back holding my little camera, and another person. The thing I remember most about him is not what he said about civil rights. I remember he just used a lot of cuss words. And the same thing repeats itself later when he comes back to South Carolina to win in this case. And the same thing, I'm riding around in the car, and he's still cussing, but cussing more. That's my remembrance of Thurgood Marshall, the great attorney coming to South Carolina.
And the moral of that story is that all of our heroes are human. One important note.
Briggs, Brown v. Board. We won the case in '54. Now, the Supreme Court had to say, those 9 judges in Black Rose had to say, how are we going to, how are these things going to work? How are we going to implement this case? 1 year later, 1955, they came back with a remedy. We will integrate all delivered speed. I grew up in New York City. It took years and years. In my hometown in South Carolina, 10 years. I thought if I had my rights, I need to receive them with Lena a year. For 10 years. So the courts threw us to the wolves, black folks that is. Know that all delivered speed, we're going to have to fight this case over and over and over throughout this country, which we did. So nobody never questioned the Supreme Court. Why did y'all, 9 judges in Black Robe, leave all this fight to black people in the North, where I grew up, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn? Boston was the answer. It never worked. In Boston, it never worked across this country. So nobody ever wrote that the 9 judges, y'all made a mistake. Take it back. But we paid that price for all these years to fight for a thing called integration that is still, I'm not getting that question. Mr. Williams, you asked a question, but I wanted to get that off my chest, but it was the heavy price that we don't put on those 9 judges. Now today, Cecil and I are now trying to fight a name change. We're back at the Supreme Court. Now, do you think the Supreme Court wanted to hear what Cecil Williams and Nate Briggs trying to say that changed this name? Then they will admit that those 9 judges 70 years ago made a mistake. Now we can say Briggs v. Elliott out of South Carolina is the proper name, it's the proper case to say. That's the kind of fight that I think that we're at right now, recognition for the South Carolina case. So we went to, last year, I think November, the decision came back that they was not going to hear our case, but that doesn't stop us. What it did, my folks that I knew from the case in Virginia says whatever y'all do now in South Carolina, continue. Because now you're talking about another case. Now we've raised up the Virginia case, Farmville, Davis versus Prince Edward County. The folks in Los Angeles Times and the New York, Washington Post had articles on this case that we at least attempt to change his name. It was positive, you can Google that, positive information about a name change. At least the world began to know there's a case down there in South Carolina that's long to have his name changed. That was to me influence to do that. My friend in Kansas saying, what the heck are y'all doing down there in South Carolina? Y'all crazy to change the name. Don't you know it's Brown? And I'm saying, for years I'm going around this country, especially in the North where I live, I got to explain to them what is Briggs v. Elliott, because all they know is Brown. The educational system, and I try to go in every school if I can. Let me look in the textbooks, see what's here about this case. They got Brown, but it's 4 other cases. So whoever was writing the textbook had it wrong. If it's wrong now, it's going to be wrong. Wrong then is wrong now. pick up textbooks, we got authors that talk about this case, and said that my father moved to Florida, never came back. They never came to South Carolina to write the true story. Handful of authors did come here. Richard Crook is one of them. But they at least took the attempt to come into a little country town and hear the case. Majority of authors do not. Most time I look in these history books and I go right to the index. If you don't have Briggs in it, then I'll take the author. I'm not reading your book. Not reading it. So it's just a tough situation for me. Not even tough. It's a pleasure to do this. Trying to change the name that for 71 years people don't want to know about Brown, because now we open Pandora's box. What else you got wrong? Just the name wrong? The case was done wrong? Did Governor Burns throw some wood in the fire that we don't know anything about? Was they challenged with the NAACP and Legal Defense Fund because they were running out of funds? Now we're going to shift it to Kansas? Kansas, we know, and I think the Kansas school, the elementary school, was already integrated. I mean, the high school. But Linda Brown had to go through this thing about integrating the school in Monroe School in Kansas City.
Imagine for a moment that you start a case in little Clarendon County, South Carolina, and for 2 years you are the single case sitting at the Supreme Court level while it is being deliberated and say fine-tuned for preparation for a discussion and bringing before the United States Supreme Court. And all of a sudden, the governor of your state, and you see, the Brown versus Board of Education decision is composed of 5 cases. But it's named after the Topeka, Kansas case, which was the 4th of the 5 cases to come forward to the Supreme Court. Now, in all the history of the Supreme Court, they had usually used 2 ways of naming a class action suit. Number 1, alphabetically, and so BROWN comes after BRIGG, so that they overstep that. And then chronologically. So for 2 years, here's the this Clarendon County, South Carolina case, Briggs versus Elliott, and the governor getting notice of this and not knowing that this is going to be a nationally recognized case. He telephones the governor of Kansas and asks him to rush that case. Governor Burns was a super statesman. He was very, very influential. He headed the Atomic Energy Commission. He served on the Supreme Court. 6 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court that ruled on Brown were his golf buddies, best friends, and imagine if he had a Rolodex, that would be on his Rolodex. And he influenced them to not use the South Carolina case, telling them, in fact, that wouldn't it be better so as not to punish the South for the case to come from the middle of the United States to Topeka, Kansas, rather than a deep South case. And by the way, the NAACP even went for it. Robert Carter, who went to Topeka to field that case and get all the testimony and that kind of thing, also said the Thurgood Marshall, who was devastated by the fact that Briggs had been pushed backwards and not going to be named. Robert Carter said to Thurgood Marshall, Thurgood, maybe this might be a blessing in disguise. We might have an easier task to win this case by coming from Topeka, Kansas. So what's in a name? Who in here knows maybe who was the first black Miss America? If you aren't, being first does matter, even today. My last statement is, in the interest of time, being first does matter even today. And you might say, well, why are we discussing this and trying to dig up something and change the name? Because the Supreme Court has never changed a name in its entire history. I started out with my mother as a child, and she often said, boy, you're always trying to do something too big for breakfast. So Nathaniel and I launched this campaign to try to take back the name. We knew we were was uphill battle, and with the present makeup of the Supreme Court, we knew we weren't going to win, but we have raised the awareness that something stunk in that particular case, and we will never give up that battle. The last statement I'd just like to say is that, again, the Supreme Court and what it did in 1954, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, again, where we were separate but equal, is a very important case. Now, you might say, sitting in this room today, 2025, is it relevant? Is it important today that we revisit and try to make correct something that is incorrect in our society? Yes, it is, because look at what's happening today, wherein the domino effect, the repercussions of what happened 71 years ago at 12:52 today, it would be exactly 71 years since the Supreme Court decision was rendered. And we have today a national mindset coming from Washington, D.C. that wants to even destroy this, don't want to bring this up, the fact that people, citizens of the United States of America were treated wrong back then, and still yet today, and they want to erase that. So that's the uphill battle we are fighting.
And that's a good point.